An elderly black woman never imagined that in a mere instant, her life would take a tragic turn when two aggressive police officers suddenly rushed at her, unjustly accusing her without any basis. Before she could react, she was thrown to the ground, handcuffed, and brutally beaten. Yet, the terrifying part was that this incident escalated into an even greater injustice. You won't believe what happens when her son, the head of the police department, arrives at the scene. Stay tuned to the end to discover the shocking twist in this story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Your support helps us continue to bring more powerful and heartfelt stories. Margaret Brown, a black woman in her 70s, walked slowly into her familiar park. Each day at sunset, she would sit on an old wooden bench here, listening to the wind rustling through the trees and immersing herself in memories of her life, filled with ups and downs. This park was not only a quiet refuge, but the one place where she truly felt at peace. A haven where she could escape the city's noise and stress and reflect on her past, which bore the imprints of every step she'd taken from youth to old age. In her younger years, Margaret had been active in the civil rights movement. She had witnessed and endured many injustices, from hostile looks to discriminatory actions that made her feel invisible in this world. Yet, she never gave up. Her resilience was not just for her equality, but for the future, for her son, Charles. She raised Charles to be an honest, responsible man who would stand up for justice. Now, Charles had become the city's police chief, a role that filled Margaret with immense pride. Despite societal progress and the reforms she had seen, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that some things hadn't truly changed. Though she had lived through the fierce days of racial segregation, she still sensed the lingering prejudices and silent judgments that persisted, sometimes subtly, sometimes openly. This was why she came to the park, to release the weight of these heavy thoughts, to find a fleeting peace amid everything. As Margaret drifted in her memories, a patrol car slowly approached the park. Inside were two police officers, Officer Johnson and Officer Smith, searching for a black suspect who had reportedly escaped from jail that morning. Rather than continuing their search for the actual suspect, their gaze suddenly fixed on Margaret, an elderly black woman sitting alone on the bench. To them, she seemed the perfect scapegoat, someone they could arrest and report without caring if she was involved or not. With a cold, calculating look, Officer Johnson whispered to Smith, "Hey, look at that old lady. She seems perfect as a stand-in, don't you think?" Smith smirked in agreement. "No one will care. She's nobody, and whatever story we make up, people will believe it." Lost in thought, Margaret didn't notice the patrol car drawing closer until it stopped right by the park entrance. Johnson and Smith opened their doors and walked towards her, their footsteps like those of predators closing in on their prey. Margaret still hadn't realized what was happening, but a gut feeling warned her that something was wrong. When she looked up, her eyes met the cold stares of Johnson and Smith, and she sensed that something terrible was about to unfold. In that brief moment, her life's memories flashed before her once more. The images of her struggles for civil rights, the times she'd been oppressed but refused to yield, and the moments she had encouraged Charles always to hold on to what was right, no matter what life brought. These memories rose in her heart, standing in stark contrast to the injustice she was about to face from those approaching her with dark intentions. This would be a defining moment Margaret had never thought she would have to face again in her life, especially now when she was old, weary, and only wished for the simple peace of sitting in a quiet corner of the park. As Margaret looked up, she saw two police officers standing right in front of her. Their expressions were cold and full of disdain, as if she were a dangerous criminal rather than an elderly woman sitting peacefully in the park. Officer Johnson, with a harsh tone, jerked his chin at her. "Get up now." Margaret, confused and unsure of what was happening, stayed calm and asked, "Excuse me, what's going on, officers?" Her voice was gentle, yet it showed she wasn't intimidated by their presence. Instead of responding, Officer Smith smirked mockingly, and before she could understand, Johnson grabbed her arm, pulling so roughly that she stumbled, nearly falling. Margaret steadied herself, her voice calm, yet tinged with confusion. "I'm just sitting here. I haven't done anything wrong." But her words fell on deaf ears. Without another word, Johnson twisted her arm behind her back and slapped on handcuffs, the cold steel biting into her wrists, making Margaret flinch in pain. The sound of the handcuffs clinking echoed in the quiet of the park, signaling the injustice about to unfold upon her. Smith pushed her to the ground without a shred of compassion, causing her to fall hard, her knees slamming against the solid earth. Pain shot through her aging body, and she gritted her teeth to keep from crying out. Margaret tried to stand, but her knees had weakened from the fall, and her hands were tightly cuffed behind her back. She tried to explain, her voice wavering yet calm. "You've got the wrong person. I'm not who you're looking for." But the two officers didn't bother listening. To them, she was nothing but a convenient scapegoat, an easy target to meet their quota without needing to explain. Officer Smith, his eyes cold and empty, spoke with a sneer. "Oh, you think you're someone important, demanding explanations?" Then, without hesitation, he grabbed Margaret's frail arm, roughly pulling her to her feet. Margaret cried out in pain as they pulled her up forcefully, but the two officers showed no sign of sympathy. Her eyes blazed with a mixture of anger and helplessness. "What are you doing? I haven't done anything wrong," she shouted, her voice trembling but determined. However, her pleas seemed to vanish into thin air. Johnson, Smith's partner, grinned coldly, pressing the cuffs harder on her wrists as he spat, "Don't argue. We have the right to arrest you if we see fit." Though physically frail, Margaret's spirit remained unyielding. She struggled to free herself from their grip, her old eyes filled with indignation. "Do you even know who I am? I've lived my life with integrity and never broken the law. What gives you the right to treat me like this?" She mustered all her strength to resist, knowing well that her physical power was no match for these young, strong officers. The struggle between Margaret and the two officers only heightened the tension. People nearby began to murmur, some quietly taking out their phones to record the unjust scene, but most hesitated, not daring to step in for fear of getting caught in the conflict. "Stay still, or you'll make things worse," Smith yelled, his voice filled with threat. Johnson bent down, gripping her shoulder as he hoisted her up again, a sneer of disdain across his face. "What can an old lady like you do to resist? Cooperate and let us do our job." In pain, but not defeated, Margaret looked Johnson directly in the eyes. "And what exactly is your job? Arresting innocent people to meet your targets? Do you have any humanity left?" She didn't shout, but her voice rang with defiance, momentarily catching both Smith and Johnson off guard. However, their surprise quickly morphed into anger. Smith turned to Johnson, lowering his voice yet barely concealing his frustration. "Let's not waste any more time. Get her to the station." Johnson nodded, tightening his grip on Margaret, yet he couldn't ignore the eyes of the onlookers who were now all fixated on him. The crowd, witnessing the scene, grew more agitated. People nearby began murmuring in frustration, their eyes filled with disapproval. A young woman, her hands trembling as she held her phone recording, raised her voice. "We're watching." This is senseless brutality. She hasn't done anything wrong." Others around her nodded, and the murmurs shifted into loud words of condemnation. "Why are you doing this to an elderly woman? Is this how the police protect citizens?" A middle-aged man stepped forward, his voice seething with indignation. He pointed directly at the two officers, his gaze showing clear disgust. Others in the crowd joined in. A young man in a worn-out hoodie raised his hand and shouted, "We won't stay silent. If you think you can hide this, you're mistaken. Our cameras have captured everything." More people, drawn by the commotion, gathered around, and each shout of protest rolled toward the two officers like relentless waves. "Let her go!" A voice called from the back. "We won't let this go unchallenged." Despite her pain, Margaret felt the power of these voices rallying around her. She looked over the crowd, meeting the compassionate, supportive gazes of those standing up for her. People who had once stayed silent were now united in her defense. Every voice seemed to lend her strength in that moment. An elderly woman at the edge of the crowd, her voice trembling yet resolute, shouted, "I've lived long enough to see a lot of injustice, but this is the last straw. We won't allow you to keep abusing your power like this." The crowd didn't just stand idle. A group of young people stepped forward, forming a barrier between Margaret and the officers. One of them shouted, "We're not afraid of you. If you keep this up, we'll defend her with everything we have." Smith and Johnson began to feel the pressure. Smith turned, casting a warning look over the crowd, trying to maintain an air of authority. "Back off! You're obstructing justice," he shouted, but his voice was drowned in the crowd's anger. Some people moved close enough to reach out to Margaret, stopped only by the two officers standing in their way. "Justice?" A tall man scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You call this justice? Assaulting an innocent person? Arresting an elderly woman without cause? Don't push us any further." The shouts grew louder, some raising their fists and chanting, "Justice for the old lady! Let her go!" The atmosphere was charged, like a fire igniting within the crowd. Those who had initially observed in silence now joined in, forming a large circle around the officers and Margaret. Now, visibly nervous, Johnson subtly pulled on Smith's arm and whispered, "We should stop. This is getting out of control. If this spreads, we could lose our jobs." But Smith, his face red with rage and humiliation, shook off Johnson's hand. "Shut up. We can't let them think we're weak." Yet Smith's stubbornness couldn't quell the crowd. Some people had already called the authorities, and voices demanding media presence grew louder. "Bring the police chief here. We want justice now," shouted an elderly woman, her eyes blazing with anger. Those present didn't just condemn the officers. They began to shield Margaret. A young woman stepped forward, draping her coat over Margaret's shoulders in a comforting gesture. Another man helped her stand more steadily, trying to shield her from the officer's harsh handling. "You're not alone," the young woman whispered to Margaret, her voice filled with determination. "We won't let them hurt you any more." The air around them seemed to shift. The two officers, once in control, had become the focal point of fierce criticism. The crowd, initially mere spectators, had transformed into defenders, voices of resistance against injustice. Smith and Johnson now stood in silent tension, feeling the weight of the angry, accusing eyes fixed on them. Despite her aching body, Margaret felt a surge of hope rises within her. She was no longer alone, and this showed that even a small voice could inspire and ignite a collective spirit of unity within a community. This was no longer just her fight. It had become a symbol for everyone who had ever been wronged, and in that moment, Margaret knew that truth would prevail, no matter how difficult the journey might be. At that moment, Charles Brown, the local police chief and Margaret's son, was walking near the park, trying to unwind after a long day. His work at the police department required him to handle countless issues daily, and this park was his refuge. He also knew his mother often came here in the afternoons to find a bit of peace amid the busy rhythms of the city. As he entered the park's gate, Charles noticed a patrol car parked a short distance ahead. Instinctively, he focused his attention to make sure everything was all right. His eyes quickly picked out two officers roughly handling an elderly woman, shoving her to the ground and handcuffing her. Then he recognized the woman. It was his mother, Margaret. For a moment, Charles froze, unable to believe his eyes. But as shock gave way to anger and disbelief, he ran toward them without hesitation. "Stop right now!" Charles shouted, seeing the officers dragging his mother toward the patrol car. He rushed forward, pulling out his badge to make sure they recognized him. "Stop. I am Charles Brown, the police chief, and the woman you're manhandling is my mother." The two officers, Officer Johnson and Officer Smith, turned around, looking at Charles with a mix of surprise and disdain. They didn't recognize him and seemed unfazed. Johnson raised an eyebrow, smirking as he sneered. "Well, isn't that a surprise? A black guy claiming to be the chief of police. This just got interesting." Smith laughed mockingly, his eyes brimming with ridicule. "Looks like we're in for a show. The police chief, huh? And his mom? That badge has to be fake." Charles stayed calm, though fury boiled within him. "You're making a grave mistake. Release her immediately and reconsider your actions," he said, his voice firm and authoritative. He took a step closer, his gaze piercing, hoping his presence would make them realize who he was. However, Johnson and Smith showed no intention of stopping. Johnson stepped forward, facing Charles with a cold, challenging stare. "We don't need to listen to some stranger claiming to be our boss, especially a black guy like you. Now, step aside if you don't want to get into trouble." Charles locked eyes with Johnson, his gaze unyielding. "This isn't a request. It's an order. If you don't release my mother right now, I'll make sure you face the consequences." The strength and authority in Charles's voice began to draw attention from passers-by. Some people paused, watching intently, and a few started recording. Still, Johnson and Smith seemed unfazed. Smith grabbed Charles's arm and twisted it behind his back with a roughness that made him wince in pain. "Oh, look at that. Another troublemaker resisting arrest," Smith sneered. "For the last time," Charles said through gritted teeth, "let go of me and my mother and end this abuse of power." His words only fueled the officer's contempt. Johnson and Smith exchanged a glance and laughed, their eyes filled with arrogance and disdain. Johnson shook his head, sneering. "A black guy daring to threaten us? Sounds like a joke. I don't believe for a second that a black man could be chief of police." Charles struggled to stay composed, his anger rising. His hands were cuffed behind his back, but his gaze remained steadfast. Margaret, sitting handcuffed in the car, could do nothing but call out weakly, "Charles, don't do this. Don't let them hurt you even more." Smith glanced at Margaret and shook his head with a sneer. "Mother and son, both troublemakers. We'll deal with both of you," he said, shoving Charles roughly into the back seat of the patrol car next to his mother. In the car, Charles looked at his mother, her face filled with pain and worry. He lowered his head, his voice full of regret. "Mom, I'm sorry you had to go through this. I tried to change this department, but in the end—" Margaret shook her head gently, her eyes tender yet filled with sadness. "Charles, this isn't your fault. This is the fight we've faced our whole lives. You've done everything you could." Charles clenched his fists in frustration and anger. He believed that his position and power could change the system from within, and that he could protect others from discrimination and injustice. But sitting here, handcuffed like a criminal beside his mother, he realized this battle was far from over. Meanwhile, Johnson and Smith sat in the front, continuing to jeer and make remarks about the uppity black mother and son. They had no idea that, within minutes, the truth would come to light, and their actions would bring consequences beyond their control. Yet, at that moment, fueled by arrogance and abuse of power, they still believed they held authority and could punish whoever they wanted. The patrol car rolled onward toward the station, carrying Charles and Margaret, two innocent people unjustly detained. Charles knew that once they reached the station, the truth couldn't stay hidden for long, and he would do everything in his power to seek justice for his mother and hold these officers accountable. But for now, the humiliation and anger weighed heavily on him, with a promise to never let his mother endure such injustice again. Charles had once believed that with enough effort, he could overcome prejudice and prove that not all police officers were the same. He faced suspicious looks, whispered remarks, and being sidelined in important decisions, all because he dared to speak out against wrongdoing others ignored. He remembered the arguments with colleagues, fighting for fairness for everyone, regardless of race or status. The skeptical and disdainful looks never discouraged him. He had always believed that persistence would lead to change from within. But now, sitting in the back of a patrol car, his hands cuffed like a criminal, next to his elderly mother, he felt the profound sting of helplessness. He realized that his efforts hadn't been enough to combat the deeply ingrained injustices of the system. The very institution he had hoped to improve had now subjected him and his mother to shame. Looking at his mother, Margaret, small yet serene, he saw that she still held faith in him, as if to say she'd faced far harsher battles. Her calmness gave him strength. Charles resolved not to give up. Despite the powerlessness he felt, he couldn't let it defeat him. Margaret had spent her life facing injustice, and he knew he had to continue fighting, not just for her, but for everyone in similar situations. The streetlights passed by like streaks in the night as the car moved steadily toward the police station. Charles knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. At that moment, he didn't focus on the humiliation, but on what he would do to protect his mother, defend his dignity, and continue his fight. The patrol car stopped in front of the police station, and Officers Johnson and Smith immediately got out, hauling Margaret and Charles out with smug satisfaction. Margaret, with her hands cuffed and a weary expression on her face, struggled to stay upright. Charles, the police chief now treated like a criminal, looked at the two officers with a cold, furious gaze. Unaware of the grave mistake they'd made, Johnson and Smith continued with their arrogance. As the two officers led Margaret and Charles into the station, they mocked them with taunting words. Johnson glanced at Charles and sneered, "How's it feel, Chief Brown? Bet you never imagined coming to the station in handcuffs, did you?" Smith joined in, laughing with delight. "Oh, yeah. Probably the first time in his life he's getting a taste of what it's like to be on the other side." Charles remained silent, suppressing the rage building inside him. He knew he had to stay calm. Any impulsive reaction would only make things worse. Despite the injustice, he reminded himself that once the truth came out, these power-abusing officers would face the consequences. Inside the station, other officers began to notice the commotion. They saw two officers leading a middle-aged man and an elderly woman in handcuffs, immediately drawing curious glances. Some recognized Charles, their police chief, in cuffs, and couldn't believe what they were seeing. The atmosphere in the station grew tense, with murmurs spreading as everyone tried to make sense of the situation. Among the crowd was a young officer named Danny, who deeply admired Charles for his integrity and commitment to justice. Danny watched from a distance, feeling that something was amiss. Observing Johnson and Smith's rough treatment of Charles and Margaret, he decided to investigate further and offer support if necessary. With cautious steps, he followed Johnson and Smith, hoping to uncover clues about the misunderstanding. As Charles and Margaret were brought to the central area of the station, Lieutenant Taylor, a senior officer, stepped out of his office, noticing the unusual gathering. He approached with a stern, inquisitive look. When he spotted Charles, he froze in shock. For a moment, he couldn't believe his eyes. The police chief, a man he respected immensely, was standing there in handcuffs like a common criminal. Unable to hide his astonishment, Taylor stepped forward, his authoritative voice cutting through the murmurs. "What's going on here?" Johnson turned to face Taylor, his expression indifferent as he replied, "We just apprehended 2 troublemakers in the park, Lieutenant. This guy claims he's the police chief, but who'd believe that?" He shot Charles a look of disdain, as though dismissing his words as worthless. Taylor's eyes shifted from Johnson to Charles, his face becoming more serious by the second. He stepped closer to Charles, locking eyes with him as if to confirm something. Charles met his gaze with steadfast determination, and at that moment, Taylor understood the truth. "What did you just say?" Taylor turned back to Johnson and Smith, his voice as sharp as a blade, his gaze icy. Smith, with a smug smile, shrugged and said, "Just a little con, Lieutenant. This guy probably printed a fake badge thinking we'd fall for it. We're just doing our job." Taylor, fed up with their disrespect, stepped forward, took out his keys, and unlocked Charles's handcuffs in front of everyone. The sound of the lock clicking open echoed through the station, and silence fell over the room. Once the cuffs were removed, Taylor turned to Johnson and Smith, his face radiating anger and profound disappointment. "This man is Charles Brown, your police chief, and the woman you just mistreated is his mother. Do you realize the grave mistake you've just made?" The station fell into a stunned silence. Some younger officers nearby couldn't believe what they were hearing. They looked back and forth between Charles, Margaret, and the 2 officers, their faces a mix of shock, shame, and horror. A palpable tension, along with a sense of embarrassment and dread, spread throughout the room. Johnson and Smith exchanged glances, their faces slowly draining of color. Johnson tried to speak, stammering a weak justification, but Taylor cut him off. "You were informed about verifying identities before making an arrest, yet you acted on your own, disregarding who you were handling. This is not just a lack of professionalism. It's a clear abuse of power." Smith, realizing the severity of their situation, tried to defend himself. "Lieutenant, we didn't know. We thought he wasn't." "Wasn't the chief?" Taylor interrupted, his eyes flashing with anger. "Charles Brown is one of the finest officers I've ever known. He doesn't need to prove that to you. And the woman you treated so brutally is his mother. What gave you the right to act this way?" Taylor's words struck like a knife, shattering the egos of Johnson and Smith. Their arrogance and confidence from mere minutes ago had completely vanished, replaced by fear and shame. They realized they had put themselves in an irreversible position. Charles stood, rubbing his wrists after being freed, his eyes fixed coldly on Johnson and Smith. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm yet firm. "I identified myself from the beginning and told you to stop, but you chose not to listen. You chose violence over reason, contempt over respect. Now you'll face the consequences of your actions." The station buzzed with tense murmurs. Onlookers around them whispered in shock and indignation, their faces reflecting anger and disbelief. Some younger officers who looked up to Charles as a model of what law enforcement should be now felt their respect for him deepen. They looked at Johnson and Smith with cold disdain, as though they no longer wanted anything to do with them. When the truth was finally exposed and there was nothing left to justify, Johnson and Smith stood before Charles, their once smug expressions replaced with fear and confusion. Their faces turned pale as they realized the gravity of their actions and how they could destroy both their careers and personal lives. Yet, clinging to a faint hope, they tried pleading for forgiveness. Johnson stepped forward, trying to appear remorseful, his voice shaking. "Chief Brown, we truly didn't know. If we'd known you were the chief, we would never have acted that way. It was just a misunderstanding. Please reconsider. I have a family and young kids to take care of. I don't know what I'll do if I lose my job." Smith joined in, his face full of regret. "Yes, Chief. We were only doing our duty. We honestly didn't think you were the chief. Please give us a chance. We didn't mean to hurt anyone." Charles looked at them, his gaze filled with disappointment and resolve, showing no signs of leniency. Shaking his head, he replied with a stern, icy tone, "A misunderstanding. I introduced myself at the beginning, yet you chose not to believe me. You chose violence and disrespect over listening. This wasn't a simple mistake, it was intentional, showing blatant prejudice and abuse of power." Johnson's eyes filled with tears of fear and desperation. He stepped closer, pleading, "Chief, Charles, please think of our families, our kids. We'll never act this way again. Please, show mercy." Smith nodded, his eyes full of entreaty. "We'll make it right, Chief. We realize we crossed a line, but please give us a chance to redeem ourselves. We don't want to lose everything over one mistake." Charles remained silent, his cold and determined gaze unwavering. His clenched fists reminded him of the sight of his mother being thrown to the ground, handcuffed, and humiliated, only because these two officers assumed they had the right to treat an elderly woman and a black man however they pleased. After a pause, Charles turned to Lieutenant Taylor and spoke with a firm, unwavering voice. "Lieutenant Taylor, I'm requesting that these officers be taken to internal affairs immediately. Their actions are inexcusable and must be punished." Taylor nodded, his expression grave as he fully agreed with Charles's decision. The actions of Johnson and Smith went against everything the police uniform stood for. He turned to the two officers, his voice heavy. "You've heard the chief. This uniform doesn't grant you the right to abuse, nor does it allow you to belittle others because of their race or status. What you've done is a disgrace to this profession and to everyone who wears this uniform with honor." At that moment, Johnson and Smith seemed to crumble, their arrogance shattered. They lowered their heads, unable to look anyone in the eye. Other officers in the station watched in silence, observing with disdain and disappointment. Colleagues who once worked alongside Johnson and Smith now regarded them as strangers, unable to believe the lack of ethics and responsibility they had shown. In a final act of desperation, Johnson spoke again, his voice filled with remorse. "Chief, I'm truly sorry. I know I was wrong. Please, think of our families. I don't want to lose my job. I can't provide for my family without it." But Charles remained resolute. He looked straight into Johnson and Smith's eyes, his voice low yet firm. "You didn't think about my family when you threw my mother to the ground and cuffed her like a criminal. You didn't consider the consequences when you chose to abuse your power and look down on others. You saw an elderly woman and a black man and deemed them deserving of humiliation. Now you'll face the consequences of those choices. Johnson and Smith fell silent, accepting the reality that they would have to pay for their actions. Every eye in the station was fixed on them, reflecting disappointment, anger, and the loss of respect. They realized that their fellow officers, with whom they had shared countless assignments, now viewed them as traitors to the ideals of the police force. Lieutenant Taylor motioned for them to follow, but before leaving, Johnson made one final plea, his voice choked with emotion. "Chief, please, we truly regret it. We won't ever do this again. Just give us a second chance." Charles merely shook his head, his voice calm yet unwavering. "This isn't a small error that can be overlooked. This is about fairness, dignity, and the trust of the community. You betrayed all of that. The police force doesn't need people like you." The two officers, heads bowed, followed Taylor, knowing there was no way to redeem themselves. They had pushed their careers and reputations into ruin and now had to face the inevitable consequences. As Johnson and Smith left the room, the remaining officers stood in silence. All of them felt the weight of this moment and understood that misconduct would no longer be tolerated. Those present would remember this day as a powerful reminder of responsibility and integrity. Charles turned to face the other officers, his gaze serious yet resolute. He addressed them in a voice that resonated through the quiet room. "I want everyone to understand that we wear this uniform not to abuse power, but to uphold justice, protect the public, and build trust. If anyone here believes they can act like Johnson and Smith without facing consequences, think again. We're accountable not only to ourselves, but to the community we serve." Silence settled over the room as each person bowed their head in thought. Some of the younger officers exchanged understanding glances, feeling a renewed respect and admiration for Charles. To them, he wasn't just their police chief. He was a true leader who would never compromise on justice and who always upheld the values they had sworn to protect. Margaret stood beside her son, her eyes filled with pride and gratitude. His steadfast courage had not only defended their family's honor, but it also highlighted the true values of the police force. Charles gently placed a hand on his mother's shoulder, and they shared a knowing look, both understanding that the fight for justice and change was far from over, yet strengthened by this powerful beginning. In her heart, Margaret knew that her son was living by the values she had instilled in him since he was a child: to stand up for what is right, protect justice, and always hold on to his dignity. Charles Brown had done exactly what a true leader should: defend the truth and restore faith in justice. When the station quieted down and things returned to normal, Charles and his mother, Margaret, stepped out of the main area, finding a private spot to sit and gather themselves after all they had just endured. They chose a bench in a quiet corridor of the station, where the soft lighting cast a gentle glow over their faces. Margaret sat down, her hands still trembling slightly from the tension. She looked at her hands, old, worn, and weathered from a life filled with hardship. But as she glanced at her son, sitting beside her with an aura of strength and dignity, a deep pride welled up inside her. Gently, she reached out, taking Charles's hand, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Charles, I'm so proud of you. You stood up with such courage and fought for what was right, even knowing you might face scorn and injustice. Seeing you today, I realize you've become more than I ever hoped for." Charles held his mother's hand, feeling the fragility yet hidden strength within them. The hands that had raised him, that had taught him patience, kindness, and respect, even when life was anything but fair. He looked into her eyes, his voice calm but filled with a quiet ache. "Mom, I'm just doing what you taught me to do. You've always told me to live true to my values and to stand up for justice. I'm just trying to live by those principles." Margaret nodded, her gaze filled with pride but tinged with worry. She sighed, her voice rich with emotion. "I know how much you've had to struggle in this job, Charles. You chose a difficult path, and I know not everyone supports what you're doing. You've done everything you can to bring about change from the inside, but I know it's not easy. Some in the force don't want things to change and will even try to stand in your way." Charles gave a small, resolute smile, his eyes reflecting his determination. "That's true, Mom. I know this path isn't easy. There are days I feel like I'm fighting alone, and sometimes I get tired and frustrated. But I believe that there are still people in this force who want to see it be better, who want a clean and fair police force. If I back down, people like Johnson and Smith will continue to tarnish our honor. I can't let that happen." Margaret listened, feeling both pain and pride swelling in her heart. She remembered the tough days when Charles was young and she worked tirelessly to provide for him. She had taught him that life wasn't always fair, that there would be times when he'd have to stand tall even if he stood alone. Today, she saw all she had taught him embodied in his actions. "I know, Charles. You haven't flinched in the face of injustice, and that makes me proud. You're protecting not only yourself but also our family's honor and all those without a voice. I know you'll keep doing what's right, no matter how many obstacles you face." Charles lowered his head slightly, his gaze softening at his mother's words. He squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with conviction. "Mom, I promise to use my position to make a difference. I'll work to rid our ranks of those who abuse power, who stain the meaning of this uniform. I want the police force to be a symbol not of power but of trust and protection. I want people to feel safe when they see us, not afraid." Margaret nodded, a gentle smile on her lips, though her eyes held a shadow of worry. "Are you sure you'll be all right, Charles? This fight won't be an easy one. People who hold prejudice and abuse power won't change easily. And by standing up to them, you might face pressure and even isolation." Charles looked at her, his voice tender yet filled with resolve. "Mom, I know there will be days when I'll have to stand alone, but it's your words that shaped who I am today. I won't give up. I'll keep fighting, not just for you, but for everyone like you. Those who've endured injustice yet held on to hope and faith in justice." Margaret looked at her son, her eyes glistening with tears. Her faith in him grew even deeper. "You are my pride, Charles. I know not everyone has the strength to stand firm in hard times, but no matter what happens, remember that I'm always here for you. You're never alone in this fight." Charles felt the warmth and love in her words, grounding him and giving him strength. He bowed his head, placing a tender kiss on her aged hands. "Thank you, Mom, for believing in me, for always being here. I won't let you down. I'll put all my strength into bringing change and restoring faith and fairness. I promise you, no one will have to suffer injustice again." They sat together in quiet reflection, letting time pause around them as their words and promises filled the stillness. In that moment, Margaret knew that no matter what she had gone through, her son's resilience was the greatest gift life had given her. After a while, when they both felt calm again, Charles gently wrapped his arm around his mother, helping her to her feet. He spoke in a deep, warm tone. "Come on, Mom. Let me take you home. This is the last time you'll have to go through anything like this. I promise I'll do everything to protect you and others from those who abuse power and spread injustice." Margaret looked at Charles, a smile lighting her face, and then gently leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling safe and comforted in his presence. Charles and Margaret left the police station in silence, their footsteps echoing through the uneasy, ashamed, and astonished gazes of their colleagues. Many of them, having either witnessed or known of Johnson and Smith's misconduct, had never dared to speak out. Now, Charles's decisive actions made them realize that silence in the face of injustice could lead to dire consequences. Standing at the station's entrance, Charles took a deep breath. He turned to his mother, his eyes filled with determination and deep gratitude. He spoke gently, his voice layered with emotion. "Mom, thank you for being here. Everything you taught me, your patience, kindness, and belief in justice, has given me the strength to confront these injustices." Margaret took his hand, her eyes filled with love and pride. "Charles, I only hope you'll continue on this path, no matter the challenges. I know that what you're doing isn't easy, but you're bringing about real change." As her words resonated within him, Charles realized that he needed to do more to transform the system. He couldn't allow actions like Johnson and Smith's to persist or let the public lose faith in the police force, which was meant to be a symbol of justice and safety. After parting with his mother, Charles decided to hold a press conference right outside the station. Reporters had gathered, and a crowd of onlookers awaited an explanation, whispering with curiosity and anticipation. The sight of Charles and his mother leaving the station, weary but resolute, had touched many. Charles stepped up to the podium, signaling for silence. For a few moments, there was a hushed stillness broken only by the flashes of cameras and the expectant gaze of the crowd. He looked directly into the cameras, his eyes filled with a blend of determination, compassion, and responsibility. He began, his voice calm yet powerful. "Today, I speak not just as a police officer, but as a son and a member of the community I have sworn to protect." He paused, feeling the intensity of everyone's attention. "My mother, an elderly woman who dedicated her life to teaching me patience and fairness, endured humiliation and unprovoked violence at the hands of those who were supposed to protect her. I cannot stand by while these actions continue." Charles's eyes glistened with conviction as he went on. The actions of those officers today weren't merely a mistake. They were a blatant display of prejudice and abuse, of power, issues that many in our society, not just my mother, have suffered from. As chief of police, I promise to do everything I can to change that. His words rippled through the crowd, sparking murmurs of agreement. Many had either experienced or witnessed similar injustices from the police and sensed that Charles's words were not empty promises. He continued, his voice gaining strength. "We need a police force that every citizen, regardless of race, gender, or status, can trust. We must eliminate those who abuse power and rebuild the community's faith in those sworn to protect them." Reporters began firing questions, and Charles answered each one steadily, transparently addressing each concern. When asked about the consequences for Johnson and Smith, he affirmed, "There will be no tolerance for abuse of power or discrimination within this force. Internal affairs will investigate, and there will be strict consequences to ensure that justice and accountability are upheld." As Charles spoke, his gaze occasionally drifted over the crowd, where many stood quietly listening. Some nodded in agreement, others held on to a cautious hope for change. Charles understood that to rebuild trust, he would need to back his promises with action and perseverance, and he was ready to do whatever it took to prove that. After the press conference, Charles stepped down from the podium, weary but feeling a sense of relief. He glanced back at the police station where one of the most pivotal moments of his life had just unfolded. He knew that his work was far from over, and the journey of reform would be a long one. But he also knew he wasn't alone. Among the crowd were those who believed in and supported him, including his mother, his ever-present source of inspiration and strength. Charles looked out over the city with its bright lights and bustling streets. In his mind, he envisioned a future where the police force symbolized justice, where citizens could look to officers with a sense of security rather than fear. He silently vowed to himself and all those without a voice, "We will do everything to uphold justice for those who have none. This is only the beginning, but I believe we can bring change for a fairer and more compassionate society." From that day forward, Charles's life opened to a new path, one filled with challenges but also brimming with hope. With his unwavering commitment, this story would not end as a mere cautionary tale but would stand as a beacon of transformation. His actions sent a powerful message to everyone that, while the system may falter, there are those willing to fight for reform and ensure justice for all. Charles believed that with persistence and unity, a better society could be achieved. As soon as the actions of Johnson and Smith ignited public outrage, the Ministry of Internal Affairs launched a comprehensive investigation to clarify the violations committed by these officers and assess the extent of power abuse within the local police force. A special investigation committee was formed, consisting of senior inspectors experienced in handling cases involving racial discrimination and abuse of authority, behavioral psychologists to evaluate the motives and attitudes of the officers involved, and representatives from civil rights organizations to ensure transparency and fairness throughout the investigation process. The first phase of the investigation focused on gathering all evidence related to the incident. The investigative team meticulously reviewed footage from surveillance cameras in the park where the initial encounter occurred, and within the police station where Charles and his mother Margaret were taken in handcuffs and humiliated. The park footage clearly showed the initial interaction between Johnson, Smith, and Margaret, revealing her sitting calmly on a park bench, showing no behavior or indication of being a threat or linked to any criminal activity. However, Johnson and Smith approached her aggressively without offering any warning or inquiry before proceeding with their forceful arrest. Another video recorded by a bystander captured the verbal and physical abuse directed at Charles when he attempted to identify himself and explain that Margaret was his mother. This footage served as irrefutable evidence of the power abuse and discriminatory behavior of the two officers. The investigation team spent hours analyzing each frame, documenting every action and word from Johnson and Smith to determine the degree of their misconduct. After gathering video evidence, the investigation moved into the interrogation phase. Johnson and Smith were summoned to Internal Affairs for questioning. Initially tense, they attempted to defend their actions. Johnson claimed he was merely acting on instinct, suspecting Margaret might be a suspect. He argued that in emergencies, rapid responses are sometimes necessary, which can lead to forceful actions. Smith, Johnson's partner, echoed this sentiment, stating they were simply doing their duty to ensure safety in the park. The investigation team quickly dismissed these justifications. Video evidence showed no specific reason to suspect Margaret, and their handling of Charles when he identified himself was inconsistent with standard communication and de-escalation protocols. The team emphasized that once Charles introduced himself as the police chief and explained the situation, Johnson and Smith had sufficient grounds to verify his identity rather than resorting to continued violence. To ensure transparency and fairness, the investigation team also interviewed Charles and Margaret. Charles provided a detailed account of the events, from the officers approaching his mother in the park to his introduction as police chief being ignored and his subsequent handcuffing. Margaret, still visibly shaken, shared key details about the officers' violent and unprofessional conduct, describing Johnson and Smith's discriminatory and degrading behavior, which the investigators found particularly telling. In examining whether this incident was an isolated case, the team expanded their investigation to review Johnson and Smith's work records and any previous complaints. They discovered that both officers had been reported multiple times by citizens for excessive force, discriminatory behavior, and unreasonable use of authority. However, most complaints had either been dismissed due to insufficient evidence or were superficially addressed, with little consequence for the officers involved. These findings raised questions about transparency in the local police station's management and complaint handling processes. The team began to suspect that there might have been a culture of negligence or even complicity regarding unethical behavior and power abuse. This suggested that the problem was not limited to individual misconduct, but could be indicative of broader systemic failings. To gain further insight into the behavior and character of Johnson and Smith, the investigation team conducted interviews with colleagues and subordinates who had worked with them. Several young officers, new to the force and lacking significant authority, provided valuable insights. They reported having witnessed instances of prejudice or harsh behavior from Johnson and Smith, but admitted they feared retaliation or social isolation if they spoke out. Other officers acknowledged the existence of an unspoken code of silence within the station, where inappropriate or unethical conduct was often overlooked unless a direct complaint was made. This environment allowed officers like Johnson and Smith to continue their misconduct without fear of repercussions. To better understand the motives behind Johnson and Smith's actions, the investigation team enlisted behavioral psychologists to assess the two officers. Through interviews and behavioral analysis, the psychologists found both officers exhibited arrogance and a tendency to look down on individuals perceived as vulnerable or part of minority groups. Experts concluded that both had a propensity to misuse power and displayed underlying racial biases, though they might not have fully recognized these attitudes. After a thorough investigation, the Ministry of Internal Affairs concluded that Johnson and Smith had committed severe violations of police ethics and operational procedures. Their actions were not merely the result of a misunderstanding, as they had claimed, but indicated abuse of authority and discriminatory intent. The ministry also identified significant gaps in the oversight and accountability structures at the local police station, which allowed those who abused their power to act with impunity. The trial of officers Johnson and Smith took place in a tense atmosphere within a packed courtroom. From the very beginning, both the jury and the public listened intently as the prosecutor detailed the case. Footage of the arrest and violent actions against Margaret, a senior woman with no criminal behavior, was displayed on a large screen. The courtroom remained silent as images of the two officers brutally forcing Margaret to the ground, ignoring her pleas and disregarding her son Charles's attempts to identify himself, played for all to see. The prosecutor emphasized that Johnson and Smith's actions were not only a breach of duty, but also a serious violation of professional ethics and the law. He argued that racial discrimination and abuse of power had driven the officers not only to fail in their duty, but also to inflict deep and lasting harm on both Margaret and her son, a high-ranking officer within the police force. The defense attorneys argued that the defendants were merely acting on instinct and believed they were apprehending a suspect. However, the prosecutor swiftly rebutted, pointing out that Charles had identified himself as the police chief from the start, yet they chose violence over verifying his identity. When it was Charles's turn to testify, he recounted his and his mother's experiences with clarity and composure. He emphasized that this case was not just a personal incident, but a matter of justice for all who suffer from power abuse. With an impassioned yet resolute tone, he urged the court not to tolerate anyone who misuses their authority to harm citizens, particularly those most vulnerable. In the end, the judge ruled that the evidence demonstrated the misconduct of the defendants. He declared that Johnson and Smith's actions had undermined public trust in the police force and that such behavior warranted severe consequences. With a guilty verdict, the judge sentenced Johnson and Smith to permanent dismissal and prison time for their abuse of power and the harm caused to citizens. The courtroom resonated with approval from the audience, who believed justice had been served. Charles and his mother Margaret left the courtroom with a mix of emotions. Margaret, who had endured frightening and humiliating moments, now felt a sense of relief and solace, knowing that justice had prevailed. Since the incident, she had borne not only physical pain, but also the emotional trauma of being mistreated by those sworn to protect her. Yet, upon hearing the judge's verdict, she felt a weight lifted from her shoulders and found hope that this case might serve as a lesson to prevent others from suffering the same. Standing beside his mother, Charles was overcome with strong emotions. Throughout the proceedings, he had remained steadfast, fighting to protect his mother and seek justice. Yet he still wrestled with an inner sadness. The thought of his mother, a compassionate, elderly woman, enduring such indignity due to blind prejudice and unchecked power, filled him with sorrow. Though the frustration, disappointment, and pain remained, they gradually gave way to pride as he saw that his efforts had not been in vain. As they walked out of the courthouse, Charles held his mother's hand tightly, his eyes filled with determination and gratitude. Margaret looked at her son, seeing the resilience and deep compassion within him. She smiled, tears streaming down her face, not from pain, but from pride. To her, Charles was not only a brave son, but also a warrior for justice. For both of them, this case was not merely a personal liberation, but a vow to continue fighting for justice on behalf of the voiceless. After the high-profile case, the atmosphere within the police department began to shift noticeably. The misconduct of Johnson and Smith was not only a wake-up call, but also a catalyst prompting the entire police force to reflect on itself. As chief, Charles resolved to initiate a comprehensive reform to rebuild public trust. He began by instituting mandatory ethics training sessions, emphasizing the duty to uphold justice and the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or social status. Charles also implemented a stricter complaint handling system, with transparent and swift investigations for any reports of misconduct. He established an anonymous reporting system, allowing officers to report their peers' violations without fear of retaliation. Additionally, he encouraged young officers with integrity and a sense of duty to participate in community outreach programs, helping them gain a deeper understanding of those they served and protected. Change did not happen overnight, but Charles remained undeterred. He dedicated more time to speaking individually with officers, listening to them, and encouraging open discussions about justice and responsibility within the community. Charles understood that this journey would be challenging, but he believed that as long as one person remained committed, change was possible. With his determination and perseverance, Charles transformed the police station into a place the public could trust. a place where those serving justice were truly protectors and not a threat. Charles's journey for justice did not end with his mother's case. It became a beacon of hope for many others, illuminating the possibility of a fairer society. He knew that each step forward was a promise to the community, a pledge to uphold noble values, transcending prejudice and power abuse. Though the road ahead was difficult, Charles believed that if one person dared to stand up, many others would find the strength to follow, working together to build a police force that citizens could trust and rely on. His goal was to ensure that no one would live in fear or endure injustice without protection. The story of Charles and his mother, Margaret, serves as a powerful reminder that justice should not be compromised by prejudice or abuse of authority. Through his courage and determination, Charles not only defended his mother's dignity, but also brought hope to the entire community. What are your thoughts on Charles's decision when faced with his colleagues? Share your reflections in the comments. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to help spread inspiring stories like this. See you next time.